All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. I think we can all project our voices enough to where we're not going to use the microphone, except for maybe some of the audio here. We have a couple of video clips around the presentation. So welcome to Mobile Apps in the Oil Patch. My name is Justin Western. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Nomadic. On my panel today, I have George King from Apache and Kelsey Ruger, who's my CXO over at Nomadic. So I'm going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves so you can learn a bit more about them.
I thought you just did.
There's more to you than that.
Oh, okay. I'm Apache's Distinguished Engineering Advisor. I work in the areas of operations, fracturing, completions, and about any side of the technical part of it that there is. I'm primarily interested in this particular application for what we can do with it inside the operations field themselves about coordinating and tracking what's going on in the field.
My name is Kelsey Ruger. As Justin said, we work together at Nomadic. I am responsible for helping merge the gap between technology and what people see on the interface. And I think with mobile, it's particularly important just because what we've seen in the way people are using the devices and sort of the pervasiveness of those devices in everyday life and business.
So just because we would like to get a better understanding of who the audience is that we're talking to today, I'd like maybe to take just a few minutes at the beginning here. If you could tell us your name and the role you play, that way we can maybe tailor some of the messaging throughout the presentation to the audience better. So we can start over here at the front of the room, just your name and the role you fill in your current job.
You don't have to worry about me. I'm with the event.
All right, so he's the event coordinator with OilComm. All right, you, sir.
Yeah, I'm a senior project engineer, sort of all things we do telecom from PC to data.
Okay. Sales? Okay.
16 million.
Okay. Sir?
And the UHR, work for Shell, and I look after the delivery of the telecom software in the
Okay, great.
I'm Tom Toby. I work for Shell and I'm leading the design office, design office.
Okay, sir.
CTO for network.
All right. With that?
Network engineer for emerging technologies.
Okay.
Web app developer for
Shell Field Telecoms Functional Excellence. Shell as well, Field
Wow.
Telecoms, capability and community.
Great.
My name is Abhi Kelsey, also from Shell. Field Telecom is the engineer and the staff.
Chris Swindle is the U.S. Gas and Power IT infrastructure manager.
Okay. Sir?
I'm Jeff Jewett with Pason. We do drilling instrumentation and applications, and I'm a project manager for new product introduction.
Okay.
My name is Jonathan Kinghorn. I'm also with Pason, product manager for wiring networks.
Also, track record with PhD Bulletin, telecom balance for Gulf of Mexico production of worldwide.
Okay. Anyone else over there? How about here in the front?
Yes, Ken Miller, Chief Architect and Global Service Delivery Manager for AT&T.
Okay. Sir?
Smith, business development, oil and gas group at Sprint.
Mary Sherry, business development, oil and gas group at Sprint.
I'm and telecom engineer for PhD Building. Communication engineer and project manager for enterprise product.
Okay.
Marie Claycom, customer service at we do video collaboration.
Great.
That's Jerry, that's Chief Operations Officer.
Okay.
Also, video collaboration.
Oh, very good. Yes, sir.
Chief Whitewall, Baker Hughes, Communication Services Coordinator.
I'm Stuart Eo, VP manager for Global Logics. We're an engineering firm focusing on safety, security, environmental, and about a billion other things.
Yes, sir.
Les Semak, I'm a product manager with Pason Systems. We do billing, data acquisition, and development.
Okay.
David Woodland, Pioneer Natural Resources. I'm the project manager for field connectivity.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Dean Jordan with Viasat, business development, and out of Dallas, and we have high-speed satellite communication systems.
Patty Chang, I'm also with Viasat and Project Marketing.
There's Gallo with that systems, project manager, IT construction and infrastructure.
Okay, good. So fairly diverse audience we got here today. So this is kind of our roadmap for the next hour and 45 minutes or so. We're going to talk about the mobile landscape as it exists today. And just some ground rules. We want this to be pretty interactive. If there's something that you guys find particularly interesting, we'd love to maybe zoom in on that a bit more. So you can't really do a lecture for 2 hours, I've found, unless you're a really good professor. George might be able to lecture for 2 hours, I don't know. But we want it to be interactive, so raise your hand, whatever, throw something at us, we'll talk about things. So after we talk about the mobile landscape, we want to do an exercise to get a feel for how you all perceive what the mobile process should be if you're looking to mobilize some portion of your workforce, arm them with apps. What are your thoughts on how that should work? And then we can talk about some of the approaches that we've seen that have worked well in other operators and service provider organizations. Then the last thing we'll cover is all about context. There are some really interesting technologies that have matured within the past 18 to 24 months that I know have Kelsey and I really excited. And a lot of the buzz right now is on the consumer side, but we think the real opportunity here is definitely in the enterprise space, and specifically oil and gas. There's a lot that context can bring to the table. So let's go ahead and do our first exercise of the day. So Kelsey, I'll let you tee us up on this.
So one of the things we like to do really early on is ask you, like, what do you guys think of mobile, and what do you define as a good mobile solution? And the first thing, just by show of hands, how many of you have already worked on a mobile project inside your company? A few hands. How many of you are here maybe because there's one coming up and you think you might be able to pick up some pointers in this session? So probably about what we'd expect. So one of the things that we like you to do, and we'll come around and pick up these cards, is before the session we place some index cards on each of the tables. If you guys could take maybe 3 minutes to jot down your definition of a good mobile solution, and then we'll move forward from there. And
do you want to frame kind of what you mean by mobile solution? I know we don't want to.
No, I don't.
Okay, so we're going to leave it. Fair enough. We're going to leave it sufficiently big.
You could use as many cards as you want.
Yeah, fair enough.
Oh, you don't have a pen?
Do you have some in your bag?
I always have a pen.
I know, that's true. Why do I want to ask? Did anyone else need a pen, writing utensil? We're all good? Okay. Cool.
I can help collect the card. Help collect cards.
Awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, this way.
We'll have to tip you at the end instead.
Oh,
From the introductions. Cool. I guess we can sort them while the video plays. Yeah.
This is great because my company is having a walking competition, and I have to monitor rooms from sitting all the time, so I'm like relishing it.
Yeah. Seize the opportunity.
It's interesting. We'll talk a little bit about how the devices are changing behavior.
Yeah.
I'm in the lead for it.
So when you're going up the escalators, are you actually walking up the escalators?
Oh yeah. Taking the long way back to the
Sure.
Anyone?
Another one thing to grab.
All right, while you folks are finishing up, we've got a short video here. It's about 2.5 minutes long that we're going to show you next. It's actually one that Google put together. You'll notice some of the applicability here, or the focus is definitely more on the consumer and kind of small business space, but we'll kind of try to connect it back to enterprise and the oil patch at the end of the video. So let's go ahead and start this.
There's a mobile movement going on. The rise of smartphones is creating smarter consumers, creating more opportunity for smarter marketing. Smartphones are always on, always with us, and always connected. In 1 week, we've browsed the internet, used a search engine, watched a video, and connected with our friends, all on our smartphones. But that's info you might already know. Here's some you might not. We're using smartphones almost everywhere, even while consuming other media. Smartphones have become such an important part of our lives that many of us would give up high heels, cable TV, even chocolate, just to keep using them. They're becoming important to our shopping habits too. Smartphones have become the ultimate shopping companion, transforming us into more savvy consumers. 79% use a smartphone to help with shopping. In fact, 70% of us actually use our smartphone while in the store. We use it to find retailers, compare prices, get coupons, read reviews, and check to see if something's in stock. Which leads us to buy. Nearly 3/4 of shoppers made a purchase as a direct result of the info we got from our smartphones, either in-store, online, or on our phone. Our new mobile shopping habits are adding up to big spending across the board. And where do we do most of our shopping? Usually in our own backyards. In fact, finding local information is one of the most popular smartphone activities. We're using our phones to find everything from the nearest pizza place, to movie showtimes, to finding the nearest store that carries the item we're looking for. And 88% of us use that local information and take action within a day, whether to call or visit a local business. Over the past year, mobile search queries have skyrocketed to new heights as we search for everything from product reviews, to travel info, to random trivia that can help us settle bets with our friends. And while word of mouth or seeing a product in store may lead people to search on smartphones, 71% of us search because we saw an ad, both on traditional media and on our phones, and we're acting on it. 9 out of 10 mobile users have taken action, all thanks to a smartphone search. The simple fact is, mobile ads work. Recall seeing a mobile ad? You're not alone. 82% of us do. Yet 79% of top advertisers don't have a mobile-optimized website. It's important to build a good mobile user experience, because if we see a mobile ad, we tend to click on the ad, visit the advertiser's site, make a purchase, or call the business. Today we use smartphones to stay connected, to keep us entertained, to search for information on the go, and to make us smarter shoppers. And we're going to be doing a lot more of this, creating more opportunities for marketers to connect with their customers. Don't miss the mobile movement. Mobilize your marketing to reach the new smartphone consumer.
So one of the reasons Justin and I like to start with that video is we've been doing mobile pretty extensively for the last 6 years. And one of the things that we noticed right away was that the behavior that we were seeing people have in their consumer persona was almost identical to the things that they were doing in work. And so one of the things we like to point out is whether you're in the office or whether you're in the oil field, there's some things that we can pinpoint that are the same across the board. And one of the things we like to do is frame mobile in that way. And what I've been doing while the video's been playing is sort of sorting the responses that you guys gave us. And once Justin moves to the next slide, we'll talk about how we typically categorize what we're seeing in your responses.
Okay.
So at a high level, what we want to talk about today is how we frame mobile and how you guys want to approach it from not only just an understanding standpoint, but how do you go through the process of planning out and deploying a mobile solution. And the first thing that several of you said is it's portable, right? Like it's got to be something that moves with people. And what's really funny is when we were working on naming our company, a word that kept coming up was nomadic. And several of you that weren't members of our company also put nomadic or roaming and that type of thing. You have to be able to take this device with you. But what's really interesting is Generally, what people break down mobile into is those three categories that are sort of needs-oriented. We'll talk more about what those mean, but it has to be useful, meaning it serves a purpose, it's secure, and you're sure it's going to get the job done. It has to be usable, and when we talk about usable, what we mean is it helps you get to what you want to do in the fewest number of steps, so that it's easy to use and it's not something that you're going to want to delete. And the piece that a lot of people don't focus on, that we focus on pretty heavily when we talk about, is what we call desirability, or it has to be something that's engaging and keeps people on target with the thing that they're trying to accomplish. And I'll let you take the context part there.
Sure. And one thing to add to that, desirable, I like to use the word delightful, right? It shouldn't be depressing to use a mobile app, right? A lot of the times when you go to the App Store and you download a new game or a new utility that you're just going to use in your personal life, people have this kind of aha moment. Why can't my tools at the job kind of be in the same range of quality, right? Like, why does it always have to be a bad experience? And so those expectations that Kelsey mentioned, or the behaviors that they're forming when they're at home or they're out shopping, right? Those translate into what they're expecting their tools to do, especially with younger workers who are entering the workforce. So now I mentioned context earlier, contextual technologies, and these, like I mentioned, have really come to bear within the past 24, 36, 18 months. And when I talk about context, I'm talking about sensors that are on your body or that are within the devices that you're carrying around. We're talking about this aggregation of large volumes of data and being able to make sense of all that data in a way, whereas before you were kind of drowning in data. You didn't know how to parse it, you didn't know how to visualize it, you didn't know how to interpret it. There have been a lot of advances recently on being able to make that data actionable, make it actually knowledge. Don't just be a wave of binary code in a database somewhere. And so we initially saw this kind of really coming to bear within the consumer area, and that's kind of when Kelsey and I had this aha moment saying, you know, the challenges of lots of data are very real in oil and gas, right? They've been drowning in seismic data forever, right? But they didn't know necessarily how to capitalize on it in new ways. And so the technologies that are coming to bear today, we think, really help with that. So this is one chart. This is from Mary Meekers. She's with Kleiner Perkins. She does an annual report called Internet Trends. And so she's in the business of parsing data and trying to do predictions from that. And what you're seeing here on this slide is a progression and an evolution of these multi-devices that are coming in and out of people's lives on a day-to-day basis. So if it's a little small to read there, we have gaming consoles, cameras, wearables, laptops, headsets, media tablets, mobile phones. And within the course of a given day, you may pick up half of these devices. You may pick up all of these devices. If you have children, they may be picking up every single one of these devices in the context of going about their day. And so there is this need and this necessity to be able to move from device to device and kind of have that data always available to you. And we only see this trend increasing. This is 2013 data you're seeing on the far right. When we have data for 2014, we expect it to continue to grow. And I mentioned earlier the sensors. So I'm a big gadget geek. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. I'm wearing wearable technology kind of even around the house when I go about my day. The gentleman in the back, Jeff, mentioned that he was trying to game the system with his wearable wristband earlier to win the contest he was having with his coworkers for the number of steps taken. But the device that most of you will probably have on your person the most is your phone. Right? You probably got it in your pocket now. It's probably with you in your pocket when you're going around the house on a Sunday doing laundry and your chores. And what's really interesting about the devices as they have evolved is from 2007 to 2013, look at the number of sensors, the types of sensors that are now in the devices. And once you have all these additional sensors going from accelerometers, proximity, and ambient light back in 2007 to things like 3-axis gyroscope, fingerprint sensors, proximity, ambient light, you are allowed to get in a passive way much richer data. And then if you know how to act upon that data, you can do a lot of interesting things. We also have the Samsung Galaxy S5 down there at the bottom, and they're kind of really pushing the envelope in terms of what you can gather. But think about some of the applicability here with heart rate, right, or gestures. Let's say you're in a dangerous working environment and maybe you want to head off at the pass before there's an emergency. If you had some way to infer if someone's heart rate was spiking, you're able to take action upon that before it really becomes a disaster.
So before you move on,
Sure.
One of the things that we'll point out is, like Justin said, we're big technology geeks, but one of the things that helped us really understand this is going out and seeing people in the field in context and looking at how they go about their job and then applying it back to the technology. And I think that's probably the first thing I'd want to sort of have George chime in on is, I think, especially in technology, we have a tendency to see the technology and then think we can come up with the solution. What we have found works a lot better is if you have full context of what's happening. For example, you may think it would be a great idea to build an iPhone app that would track certain bits of data. Well, there's certain jobs in the field where you can't have the phone in your hand, or it's not practical to have the phone in your hand, either because your hands are covered with something or you've got gloves on. And so in those cases, you maybe look at the form factor. So maybe it's Google Glass, or maybe it's a wearable device, but really the only way you can really understand that switch is by watching what people do in the field and really understanding how they go about their job.
Okay, what I see this, and what it really intrigued me with this when I first started operating, or first started hearing about this, was the fact that it addresses so many different areas that we see in the oil field almost every day. You can get into the safety aspect. For instance, as you drive towards a lease, this can log you in, log you out, or send you an alert if there's something wrong on that lease, if the sensors, for example, are reporting an H2S, hydrogen sulfide leak, or an overflowing tank, anything of that nature. You can set up an alarm system here that can be triggered, and as you even drive towards it, it's going to warn you, set off an alarm on your phone, etc. So these are some operational aspects. You've also got the bit of regulation compliance, and we're getting into a lot more and more of that as governments, either state, local, federal, whatever, are looking at the things that the oil and gas industries are doing. And of course, there's a lot of regulations, and having just understanding them is difficult enough, but trying to fill in all the information that you need to comply with each one of these while you're on a lease or while you're taking data, that's pretty significant. And what we're imagining here is, A, it's going to ask you questions. You're going to have to fill in the blanks, and it will be generally from a pick list, drop down, whatever, that will fill out those forms for you. It will assure compliance as you're filling this out. If you have a spill on the ground, for example, you can take a picture of that, and there are algorithms out there that will estimate the volume that's been spilled. And that is a reportable factor. Well, it reports it. You've got the algorithm right there. I've got the picture of it. And basically, you're covered at least to that first level. So there's a lot of different things to look at. We need to keep it on a pick list. I don't really want to have a lot of people trying to type things in, but there are some commonalities that a pick list would be just fine for. And then you've got checklists of, let's say we're going to do a certain procedure out on a well site. This will have a basic checklist of things that you need to check before you start it, during the time that you're doing it, and afterwards. And maybe some of these things have some automation that could fill in part of that for you. This is what we're looking at: optimizing performance of an individual, protecting their safety, and assuring regulation compliance. That's the big part of what I'm looking at to try to get developed.
So Kelsey, you had a user research trip out to San Antonio, or just south of there, a few weeks ago. And I know you got some insights from the guys around there. I mean, roughnecks, tool pushers, the guys that are really in the dirtiest of jobs. And they had some, I guess, comments or concerns about like the usability and the user interface considerations. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think the big things to remember is typically when you're designing apps, you're inside an office, right? Like, so you're in a
ivory tower,
consistently lit, sort of organized, regulated environment. Whereas when you go out in the field, it's almost impossible to predict the environment they're going to be in. On some days, they will be able to look at a screen and it's very readable. On other days, if it's super sunny, they won't be able to see the screen at all. when they're out in the sunlight. And so you have to account for things like that you can't account for in the office. I think the biggest thing that you hear when you talk to people in the field is that the apps don't always work with their workflow. And so if you're asking someone to, the best one I can give you is one that wasn't from this trip, but we were designing a tool calculator that was used to calculate the widths or the diameters of certain tools. Well, the problem is when these guys are using that tool, they almost always have on gloves. And the process today is they take out a book, they write it down, they run a calculation that they can run in their head. It takes them about 3 minutes, right? The app requires them to take out the app, take off the gloves, type in the numbers to run the calculation. It takes them about 10 minutes.
Wow.
And so what ends up happening is even though they have the technology available, they almost always resort back to the tried and true method. So understanding their workflow is probably the biggest takeaway from that is while they may be asked to use the app, they will probably not use it the way you want it to if it requires them to change their workflow, which they're actually being rated on.
Good point. All right, so let's talk about this, Kelsey, the people, the process, and technology. And this is kind of the lenses that we try to view some of these challenges through. You want to elaborate on that?
Sure. So typically what we start with is the people or the people doing the job. So what is it that they are trying to get accomplished? And we like to call these jobs to be done. And we call them jobs to be done because the way we look at tasks is as a big job that someone is responsible for doing. So if you've got to fill out maybe like a job safety analysis or a observation card, like where does that fit into their workflow and what's the method that they use today and how are we changing that? So ultimately what we want to do is optimize their job, not necessarily change their job, which everyone tends to push back against.
Okay.
Are we staying on process there?
Yeah.
Talk about the other two.
Sure.
From a process standpoint, there's two pieces to this. How do you translate what you're seeing as far as user needs into requirements that you can build the software around? And what's the process that you use there? I think one of the things we'll talk about, and we'll take a survey of the room, when I first started in software as a developer, we had a very, very set, traditional waterfall method of doing projects. And what we found with mobile is it doesn't work well that way. Like you've got to adjust the way you, I guess like a lot of us were taught to run projects because mobile moves so fast. If you take a long time, by the time you finish the software, either Apple's pushed out a new version of the OS that completely blows up your project, or the users have moved on to a new method of doing it. So for process, we like to put things in front of users really quickly, get feedback, and kind of assume that you're going to have many multiple releases during the year with the idea in mind that the software will get better over time.
Have any of you in the audience run into that issue? Maybe you had a software project you were working on specifically or particularly in mobile, and you were getting ready to release or deploy, and you hit the new release of the software. Because that's happened, I know, to Kelsey and I a few times, and it caused serious turmoil, for lack of a better word. Anyone have a war story, so to speak, on that front? Lucky folks. God bless you. All right. So the last piece here is technology, and Kelsey wrote down some of the job titles you all have. And there are some people in infrastructure, some folks in IT. I'm a technologist by heart. And there's a natural inclination, I think, to start with the technology because it's interesting, right? It's enabling. It's something that you can get excited about. But if you ignore those first two pieces first, odds are it's not going to help you at the end of the day. Right? If you're ignoring the people and the way they do their job, in the process by which you need to get this into users' hands, you've really missed a big opportunity there. So, technology front, anything else you want to
add? One thing I want to kind of take a poll is how many of you guys know Agile and Waterfall? I want to make sure we have a good understanding of the different project methodologies. Who doesn't know Agile and Waterfall? That's probably better. All right, so we have a pretty
informed audience. Very good.
Okay. So let's talk about the way we've seen this translate. So, you go through projects. Typically, companies boil things down into three categories that we're looking at here. They are either looking to reduce waste, increase ROI on some technology, or functionality that they have, or they want to increase productivity. Nearly every project that we have worked on in the enterprise falls into one or more of these buckets. What we will tell you, the insight that we've found, especially in that productivity category, it has to be sort of viewed through the user's eyes of what's productive. And the story I always tell is one of timesheets. So I know a lot of companies require timesheets, and one of the companies that I worked on in the past, they had a SAP-based timesheet system. The SAP client worked perfectly. You could put in your time, but they felt like it would make more sense to build a web client. Now, the web client cost about $1 million to build, but it was terrible, and no one could figure it out. And so what ended up happening was everybody would resort back to the timesheet system that was on the desktop. And when we went to ask people why they resorted back to it, they said, well, it's not productive. It's Friday afternoon. I have to get out of here, go pick up my kids, drop them off here. And so they had shifted into a different mindset of what was productive. Productive for them meant, I need to get these timesheets done as fast as possible so that I can get out of here. And so one of the things we look at when we're trying to figure out how do you balance these three buckets is sometimes it makes more sense to make a smaller change in a system that keeps users moving forward than it does to make a wholesale system change, because you won't hit that second bucket, which is an increase in your ROI. So if you burn the money on the project and no one uses the software, you've also increased waste rather than reduce it. So it's important when you are looking at these requirements to kind of match them back against the primary buckets that most projects are going to be rated on.
It's all about making money or saving money, right? That's typically the dichotomy that most decisions are made upon. George, I'd be interested within Apache specifically. I mean, of those types of categories, do you find that there's more traction with some of the initiatives because they're increasing productivity versus reduction in waste? I mean, how do you guys go about talking about that?
Productivity probably rules, simply because when you're working in unconventional reservoirs, it's economic driven, and you need to optimize very, very quickly. You need to get down to a point where you're doing things as close to the previous job as you can, but also optimizing along the way. It's a learning process. And so to increase productivity, what we found is, number one, we have to discover a learning or trip over a learning, because sometimes it's simply by accident. But once you've got that learning, that's got to be circulated around. It's got to be processed, and then it's got to be inserted back into the design or the operation where it will do the most good. So when you look at this, it's a lot of it is about the economics improvements, but that's part of the learning process. And so we do that. Now, reducing waste, that comes into it. Increase in productivity will generally result in reducing waste, either waste of time, waste of resources, waste really of talent that you get into. But we're seeing that. And the increase in return on investment here, there's a return on investment in the cash you put in and a return on investment in the time that you put in. The cash, this increased productivity will take care of itself. Time and people's skills, that's something that those are always in short supply. So that's something that we need to really focus on, because any increase there in return on investment of what you've got is going to increase productivity. It's all linked together, but productivity is what we see first.
Okay, great.
So before we move on, I want to make sure we pause, and if anyone has questions on what we've covered so far, and then we can move on. Is there any questions so far?
I just have one comment, one question. I think you're missing also the safety here as one of the objectives, especially in the oil and gas. It's pretty much important to achieve that absolutely mobile.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about with the check-in, check-out of a lease. When you get there, give it let it give you a warning. You can even give you the personal protective equipment, the PPE, that you have to be on that site. And you have to check off that you have those. That's another compliance issue that you get into. But going beyond that, we've got so many sensors in these smart devices. It's very possible that you could have a set alarm here to where if your heart rate drops too low, if you pass out, if you quit breathing, this thing is going to broadcast quickly. And in the oil field, some of them are very far-flung, and you wouldn't be able to get help there for 10 or 15 minutes. But in others, you could have somebody there within 30 seconds to a minute. And that will make the difference in saving a person's life. So these things are big. We might as well use those sensors because we've got them. And I can't see that this is going to be that difficult to actually come up with something that'll make a difference.
You know, it's probably important to point out we can't overemphasize the application to safety here. Right around the beginning of the year, did anyone read the multi-part series in the Houston Chronicle called Peril in the Oil Patch earlier this year? So there was so much attention being paid to deaths related to truck accidents, people going between leasing sites and people falling from equipment. And so that, in a lot of ways, really formed some of our initial concepts for the products that we're building right now is how can we make their jobs safer? Right? How can we prevent people from dying, if you boil it down to its essence, right? Because that's a noble ambition for one, but two, people are eager to have a better safety record, eager to have a better PR sort of standing. And so if mobile software can help in some way, then absolutely, we have to focus on that.
And that safety is linked into productivity. And to that bottom line, and you always hate to say it, it's linked into most of our bonuses.
An aspect of safety, talking about technology,
Mm-hmm.
will be the devices themselves, whether they are safe to use. It does have others environments. Would you be talking about that?
So we certainly intrinsically safe cases, for instance, and whether there is the risk of sparking. You know, it's interesting. We don't have a segment in the presentation dedicated to that by any means, but we're happy to talk. What was that? You said
I do have some comments.
Okay, so Kelsey has some comments. So I've worked with different operators in the past, and if it wasn't an intrinsically safe device, it was a non-starter, right? Regardless of how interesting or productive the application would be. George, you know, some of our initial conversations, you said, at least on the onshore side, right? Like people, there's an expectation that you're not going to have devices, but most people carry devices on site, whether it's wrong or right, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, we're pretty strict about anytime we're doing perforating, which is
right.
uses small explosive charges to punch holes in the casing down hole. There's no mobile phones, no radios on there. However, much of that is a holdover from an old technique, and educating people about what's really dangerous there and what isn't is something we need to get into. But that is a longer conversation. You know, we might have that after the session or take it offline. But we do look at that, and we try to follow that very closely as to what's allowed, what isn't allowed. Mm-hmm. But we have instrumentation on all of these wells,
right,
or almost all of these wells, that transmits pressure, temperature, flow rate, etc. So there's always something going on, and to turn off an entire location to run a perforating job, it's a big thing.
Sure.
You know, nobody likes to do that, but we recognize that we have to do it because it's required by law.
You know, we did some work with ExxonMobil the beginning part of 2013, and most of the use cases that they identified were intentionally not field related because they had those concerns. They were more kind of general productivity or kind of back office type of applications to where they could kind of learn the process of mobile and understand what the cadence of releases would need to be. But until the technology caught up from an intrinsically safe perspective, they wanted to sit on the sidelines. So I don't think there's the silver bullet answer just yet. But if folks in the audience have maybe some anecdotal stories of challenges they face, I know, Kelsey, you have some comments from
I would add to
Halliburton.
that, I tend to separate safety into two categories, and primarily because my first work with safety was with texting and driving. And so there's the device itself and whether or not it's safe, and then there's how people use the device. And there are some cases in the field where you just flat out don't want people looking at a device while they're doing what they're supposed to be doing because it's a dangerous job, or they could easily be injured if they're not focused on the job. And so just that case alone would eliminate certain types of devices, and then you're left with, does this device itself pose a risk on site?
You hit a note on that radio silence when you're doing perforation. Has anybody ever done a study or is there any plans to do a study to find out what devices are not needed around when they're doing perforation? Because I know it's just an industry standard, always go radio silence when you do perforation.
It's a holdover from the old quarry blasting where they were using a non-desensitized blasting cap. We haven't used those in the oil industry for years, and we've tracked back and actually tracked safety record. No one in the last 50 years has been killed or injured on site from setting off an explosive charge with either a cell phone or a radio. It just hasn't happened. But it's a holdover from decades and decades past. I don't look for us getting rid of it anytime soon. We know it's not necessary, but that's part of the game we play out there.
Because when you go to radio silence, it not only knocks out your cell phones and other stuff, but your microwave, and you have to be a platform offshore that's passing through that platform, then you shut down everything beyond it.
But you can't control the fishing boats and the supply boats that are going past you at the time with very powerful radios on there. So believe me, we've looked at that, and yes, it's a catch-22.
You got the radar and everything else when the ship's running.
That's right.
All right.
So, one of the things that you can see from looking at this is more than just building an app, right? So I think one of the things we like to come back to is there's a lot of things that go into determining what your app will be. And we tend to look at them as solutions. So if you were to ask Justin and I, build me a safety app, or it may be a combination of an iPhone app, maybe a glass app, eventually it'll be maybe a watch. So we're looking at context, which we'll talk a little bit later, and actually what people need to get done. So there's a lot that goes into sort of thinking through that solution versus, not just saying, I want it to be an iPhone app, because there may be some cases where that's not the best solution.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we wanted to do next is really kind of get some ideas from you guys on aligning what we call objectives and work reality. So safety is one of those. And maybe if you guys, using your cards again, can jot down some of the needs that you've seen in the field. And we can walk through how we would go through tying those back to objectives and maybe fleshing those out into requirements. So not anything really complex, but anything that you think would be of use in the field that might be applicable to mobile.
All right, so let's take a few minutes on that, and then we'll collect the cards and talk through some of them. Refill my water here. Kelsey, where do you have the next video in the slides? What's it after? I guess I could always just look on that.
Right after the quote. So keep going over. Go back to what you're.
This way?
Oh, wait. Yeah, you're going the right way before.
Okay, I thought it was further out.
It's whatever. There should be a blank page.
This is from earlier, though. I'll just look here. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So basically, we got 2 more slides in the video, so maybe we can start the video, then talk about what they wrote there, and then after we get done with the video, talk through some of the examples.
Lots of cards.
Anyone else still writing? No? Okay. Go ahead and move on. So we're about 2 slides away from another video. During the video, Kelsey and I will kind of talk through some of these, and coming down to the video, we'll talk through some of the examples that you folks put together. So now we're going to transition into the process part and how you would go from an idea maybe on a note card or an index card into a fully deployed application. And
Well, before you move, let's go.
Sure, yeah.
One thing let's kind of poll them and see what they think a mobile team looks like. Because I think
Sure.
there's some key things that we found out over the last, so if you guys were going to do a mobile project, what kind of people do you think you need to have on that team? Just shout out some roles on that team.
Typically, it's an IT group. Let's just start. Everybody thinks it's an IT.
Mm-hmm.
Designer.
Designer, okay.
We need operations for people that have hands-on.
Business analysis.
A BA, okay. Who else?
Definitely a project
Project manager?
manager. Security.
Security? Says the security guy? Was that the security guy?
This is the guy that got hit by security.
Yeah, I bet. Who else?
I've heard of some people having like psychologists or PhD, people like that really understand the human side.
Right, the human factors, sure.
Change manager.
Change manager, okay.
Think of all the stakeholders, right? Yeah.
From the business, right? Product owner, perhaps.
If you're extending an app, you're also going to have that app developing. It's an Oracle extension.
Sure. Maybe an integration guy, right, with Oracle.
I think a typical video engineer, somebody who learns about the bandwidth that the project is
Okay. So one on the hardware side, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Good.
So I guess maybe I'll let you start, Justin, just some insights into team structure or roles on team.
Yeah, it'll really depend on the type of application that you're going to want to build as well. So you mentioned, so at a high level, yes, to almost everything that people threw out. And it really depends on the scope of the project and what type of organization it's going to be built within. The smaller the team, perhaps the smaller the company, perhaps the smaller the team to actually bring this to bear. So some obvious ones, you need the developers, right? The engineers, the folks that are well-versed in whatever language of the platform that you're targeting. So on the Android side, maybe Java engineers. On the iOS side, Objective-C developers. And then Kelsey comes from a world definitely kind of from the human factors, user experience, user interface side. So I'll let you talk about maybe some of the roles
So
there.
I'll give you some additional roles, but I'll tell you some interesting things that we have seen that work really well. I think the biggest thing that we've seen is you may have, even if you have a phased project, we don't separate the teams apart. So we don't have a design team and a development team and a testing team. In fact, those people may sit in the room together, and you have a designer, a developer, a tester, maybe a human factors person, an engineer. But the reason we keep them together is because their roles overlap so much. And if you're moving them down sort of assembly line, there's a lot of things that you could miss in mobile. The other thing that seemed counterintuitive to us is in many cases it's really good to have people who are largely unfamiliar with the process that you're building the app for lead that process, because they ask a lot of intuitive questions that if you're very familiar with it, you may completely overlook or assume that everybody gets it. And so those things never get translated, and you get to the end and you look at the app and you say, well, there's some things that we assumed would be in there, but if the person is far removed from the process and they don't really understand it, you can miss a lot. So we always try to get the team members who've never been involved with the process we're building upfront access to it. So if it means a developer goes out to a rig site, which they never get to do, but I think it's important for them to have some context around what they're building because it helps them fully understand the solution versus reading the specs on a piece of paper.
So yeah, you kind of want that childlike innocence at first, right, to where you're looking at it with fresh eyes. But it's important to point out you still need to validate that process with the SMEs, right, before you go into actually cutting code, because you certainly don't want to head down the wrong path. Coming in with fresh eyes is certainly helpful, right, because from a usability perspective, it can really lend itself to keeping it simple as opposed to the way in which you were taught, the way in which the business has always done it. George, anything you want to add in terms of roles that you hear are pretty critical on a development team?
Well, the fresh pair of eyes is the one, and you mentioned that, and there was a comment out here about a psychologist who not only understands people and the things that they are likely to do and likely to not do. I think the one thing that may be missing out of it is to have someone figure out how do you reward a person for using this app correctly. And when you think about that, whether it's, if you're dealing with people out in the field, you can put levels here of learning to use the app and then using it regularly, et cetera, and there can be things that reward that person for that behavior. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to put the human process in here and realize that not everybody is going to want to change.
Sure.
I'm glad you said human. One example, how many of you guys work at companies or work with companies where they use stock cards, observation cards, or some form of card that you have to fill out to categorize a safety event? Someone, no one? So here's what typically happens is employees, if you're a driver, if you're on site, you have to fill out these cards a certain number of months. You submit it to someone. Someone says, okay, we got 300 cards in, and they track, we got 300 cards in. Well, if you add this human nature part to it, if you have someone go out and look, and this is an actual story. We went out to site and we looked at these observation cards, and we literally looked at 600 or so. Not one single one had recorded a bad event. And so what we interpreted from that is they're required to fill out these cards, but they also get dinged for safety. So what they do is they fill out the part that they get rewarded for, but they don't fill out the part that they get dinged for, which completely, for me, invalidated the entire stack of cards because we're not getting the data we want.
Right.
And so sometimes you capture data, but you actually have to look at it and see if it's really what you want. And it takes a human to kind of work through that or figure out how to change the process so that you get the data you want.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. All right, so this kind of goes back to the exercise that we just did. We're going to queue up a video next and then talk about tying needs back to goals, right? You've identified a need that maybe a mobile app could help address, but how does that tie back to a business objective, an actual goal? So, Kelsey, do you want to intro the next video? I know this is one that you've used before.
We are, we've been in mobile for a long time, and one thing that it's difficult to find is really good examples from the enterprise that we can show you guys. And so what we like to do is show very relevant consumer examples and then translate it for you, because a lot of what you see is very applicable to the work we're doing, either in the field or in the enterprise. And so this is another video that they did for Google. This is a Google UK video on how mobile really works when you put it in action.
And if it had to have a subtitle, I would call it the butterfly effect, I would say. And you'll see why here in a moment. Let's get this on. All right, so a feel-good movie from the UK there.
So one of the things that Justin and I would tell you is a lot of what we're doing today in the enterprise, started with work we did in consumer. So I spent really the first part of the 2000s working for Prodigy and AT&T doing internet browsers, dial-up DSL, dial-up. And so what we saw is that a lot of the things that we had already done research on worked in the enterprises because you're still dealing with human beings, right? Like it's just the application. And so we always like to bring that video back to really what we're talking about is how do you, in the environments that we're talking about, build software that one meets the business need and actually gets used by users in a way that's going to deliver the end result that we're looking to get.
Yeah, and two more just quick comments on that. Remember, I was talking to my wife about this weekend. Remember late 90s, early 2000s when you were going to go on a road trip and maybe you didn't have an atlas, but you were technologically savvy. You went to Google Maps or MapQuest and you printed out the directions and you felt so empowered, right? Because you were going to set off on your journey and you had this additional information. And now it just seems so quaint, right? And the dynamic nature of it was fairly fixed. You had a start point and an end point, but you couldn't just pivot on the fly. And now we can set off out our front door and go anywhere and change on a dime. And that applies in business as well. You leave the office, you got maybe just your phone and your iPad, and regardless of what comes up during the day, you can adjust to it, right? You can pivot and you can get the data you need, you can make informed decisions. And that's exciting for us. I mean, in so many ways, right? Because it empowers you. You can do things that really just weren't possible 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, that driving directions example is a good one to tie back to the field too. Because I mean, when you walk out your door today, you could be pretty confident that if you don't know where you're going, you could figure it out on the way, right? Like even if you make a wrong turn and you're running GPS, it'll correct that. Well, for some of these rig locations that are out in the middle of Texas, that doesn't work, right? And so what we're having to figure out is how do you create driving directions when you don't have, 100 cell towers around or a consistent network connection.
Right.
Or roads.
Or roads. There are no roads where we're going. All right, so through the next few slides here, we're going to talk about the mobile process. And there are, 4 different steps that we want to take you through. We've starred some of the app suggestions you folks wrote down before the movie. And so I'm going to call off some of these, and I want Kelsey and George to talk about maybe the way in which we would approach these, the considerations that you need to take into account. So in this first example, we're going to look through the lens of understanding. What exactly is the need for this? So let's start with one that is very applicable to this audience, stock management, perhaps. So I want an app that's going to help me with stock management. Where do I start? Stock, like inventory stock.
So I'll let you play the S&E role in this, and then I'll play sort of the human factor. So our questions will probably be different. So my first question would be, what is the role of who wrote the stock management idea? So I might direct some of these questions back at you. Like, what is the role of the person who would be using this app on a regular basis?
Yeah, you would need to know everything that you have in the field, especially in bidding
cost for pumps, spare cost for everything there. And there is regular updates. And they should keep stock of these updates. If it go below a certain level, it should be included again.
So the next question I might ask is, when would they be using this? Is it when the parts are running low? Is it when they are on a job and they have a specific task? When do they go and look for it?
It depends on your role. So if you are a planner, then you are doing this in the office, you know that you will get a report from the field that the level has gone down and prepare for the next purchase.
Okay.
But if you are on the stock in the field, you should be doing it on the spot.
George, you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely, and in the industry we call that an inventory tracking system. And the inventory tracking system can be either in parts, which you'll want to know what's available, where it is, if it's not there, how quickly can I get it to location, who is the specialist for actually installing that part, what's the checklist I need to go down to make sure that I can take that old part out, get a new part in, get this thing back on operation. The other piece of that doesn't have much to do with parts is your well stock that's out there. In other words, which wells are operating, which wells are high gas oil ratios, low gas oil ratios, because I've got a pipeline here that I'm trying to get maximum liquids down, and I've got to juggle wells as this thing, bringing them on, shutting them in, to get the maximum liquids down this pipeline that I can. North Slope does this all the time. They've got one whole room and 24 hours a day that is bringing on wells and shutting in wells to get maximum load in the pipeline. So these types of systems, and let's just talk about the parts. Say I have a pump in the field, a rod pump, and I've got a transmission that goes out or a gearbox that goes out. Where is the closest one? And many times the company, like the operator, the operating company won't have spare parts, but the supply store that they have a contract with does, and then you've got a work crew that's going to have to go pick that up, bring that out, meet a crane truck there, and shuffle all that around, and it gets back into not only where's the part, when can I get it, who's going to put it on, it's the logistics of getting all that together. That's the real world part of what you're talking about.
Sure.
So what we might do with this, and we won't be able to flesh it out fully, is one of the roles that the human factors in the UX team plays is we're sort of the contrarian on the team. And I might actually say, why do you have to do any of that? If we know where the person is and we have a stock system of any kind, can we proactively figure out when that's going to run out? And maybe avoid the having to check. So it becomes less of a stock checklist and more of a stock system that can actually proactively do. And this, to give you guys an example of where this works, if you guys remember, I guess it was last summer, when Walmart went through and they rearranged every single store in the United States to fit this certain pattern, that was all based on data that they had seen in the store. So instead of waiting until a customer said it's hard to go through the store, they proactively looked at the data and said, well, we can think ahead and do that. And I think one of the things we try to do when we were designing something like that is figure out how do we reduce the workload. So if we can say we've got a system that's tracking the stock, maybe we proactively check it and send a notice to the supplier and tell them, hey, this is going to run out. We predict around Tuesday. Let's call it that.
Yeah.
Sort of proactively manage that process.
I don't think it's any easier to go through Walmart, though, despite the floor layout changes.
Well, they changed
perhaps.
it back.
Well, that's the people.
That's the people.
Before you leave that, there's another piece, and this is, we've touched on the edges of this. If you can project how long a piece of equipment is going to last, you have the mean time between failures, and you have a lot of equipment that is, is going to be requiring maintenance, and you've identified the 4 or 5 major faults or breaks that are going to have, then you can coordinate your supply house having those things on site and work crews that are familiar with those. You might have to do a little training in between time, but capture your learnings and figure a way to get those back into your design and your operations. And an app could actually help with that.
Okay, let's move to the next step in the process. So we just talked about trying to understand the use case a bit more. The next part here really goes into planning, and just to get a diversity of ideas here, we'll move to a different one, but we'll infer maybe we've gone through the understanding portion of it. So some of the questions that perhaps George and Kelsey will have will be more related to this, understanding the business goals they're aligning with. So another idea from the audience was employee location tracking. Does anyone recall if that was theirs or not? You, sir, yes. So what was kind of the idea behind that?
Well, I've got staff running all over North Slope at any given time. And on any given day, they may be working on a half a dozen different internal project tracking processes that I have to go back and use when I'm going back to my client. If I can keep track of, I have a horrible problem even on their timesheets because they're up there and they work for 12 hours. And that's what they're doing. Right. If I can break their time down based on where they're at, because that generally defines what they're doing, then I can do a much better job for my client, letting them know what these various places and parts and pieces of this are taking.
Okay.
Including waiting on a herd of caribou to come across the road.
Caribou, muskox.
Yeah, been there.
Yeah.
All right, Kelsey, so let's assume we've gone through some of the understanding. Maybe we can still do some qualification questions, but what sort of typical questions would a software development team want to ask at this stage?
Well, you kind of answered one of the questions that I would have is what's sort of the underlying goal? And so the goal is really to accurately be able to track time.
Well, that's the one side. The other side is to fix the problem that the employees are struggling with, which is keeping track of what they're doing. If I can tell them, look, you don't have to worry about your start and your stop time at this location and your travel time. All you've got to do is say, what did you do here? What did you do here? What did you do here? And the rest of that's automated. I get better results and they're happier.
Sure.
It's a win-win.
Go ahead. Were you going to say something? So you touched on something that we try to do a lot of, which is to collect as much data passively as possible. Yeah. So if I was your employee and you said, okay, at the beginning of your day, start this out. Throughout the day, when they hit a certain spot for a certain amount of time, we could kind of pre-assume their stop, whether it's lat long or whether we kind of pre-allocated where that thing is in the database. Then they don't really have to do anything except go back in and say, okay, that's accurate, I was doing this here, because everyone has that problem. Even in the office, you have that problem of at the end of the week, you got to do timesheets, and now you have to remember what meeting was on Tuesday at 8:30. And all you really know is I was in another conference room. So one of the things that we would try to break down is how accurately can we track their location, and how good the fidelity of that information has to be for that particular system.
Okay. Let's move on to another one then. So that was the planning portion. Let's talk a bit about developing and deploying. So this is an interesting one. Let's see, where was it I was going to pick? Yeah, safe automatic data acquisition from a safe distance. Whose was that? All right, so what's the thinking behind that?
Remember I talked before about hazardous locations?
Sure.
Sometimes you need to acquire data from those locations without exposing yourself to them. So I'm thinking of a situation where we can use the unsafe device from a safe distance and still acquire the data.
Okay.
Really.
So what do you think there, gentlemen?
Well, there are several sites where you can't go on, you're not allowed to go on, or it's not practical for you to reach those sites. And what we've done there is we've used a variety of tools to be able to read casing head pressures, for example, annular pressures, from a distance with infrared types of tools, or we've even had some small broadcast pods that would broadcast short distance and be able to pick that up, kind of a line of sight type deal. But it could keep you hundreds of yards off location, which would serve part of that. And it all depends on what you're trying to do there and what you're trying to transmit, whether it's a heavy data stream or just a couple of data points. So I think if that is possible, I've seen some cases where it has been done. But you're right, if they could get all that information by simply driving by the main lease and seeing is anything, do I really need to stop there? And some of the sites you will need to stop to do some manual checks, but if you don't need to stop, that's one less incursion into that area.
Okay, this one, we'll stay on this slide for a second. I don't know if we have good answers to this one, but it's given the nature of the conference, let's maybe open up the floor to it. So, communicating in geographic areas without communications infrastructure. I feel like someone's about to give me a sales pitch on their company, but what have you guys done, or how have you approached this? We've talked about this a little bit in terms of, being able to save some things locally, and then once you get back with the network coverage, you sync back up. Having functionality degrade gracefully, right? So when you're outside of network coverage, I think being able to evolve back up. But has anyone faced this challenge specifically? Who wrote this on the card? Chris. Okay. Like I said, yeah.
It's not sales pitch, it's we know there are borders where our coverage does not extend down to the field areas, and that's a challenge. People love their smartphones, they're working in the cities, they're used to using them, and sometimes when they go back to these areas, you lose that coverage, and your apps have to deal with that.
Right.
Process. So part of that, to me, part of the design process is making sure your applications
are capable of that.
Capable
sure.
Of operating in those mixed environments.
Well, could you download and record, and then when you're in coverage, be able to transmit? Okay.
Going forward.
Yeah. Okay.
You take some GPS data when you're out of coverage, but then once you get coverage, mark whether it's a cellular coverage or a Wi-Fi on field locations or different.
In a previous life, I was a communications officer in the Air Force, and our squadrons that were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, they would have kind of two parallel networks on the forward operating bases, right? You had the MWR one, the morale, welfare, and recreation, and then you had the mission critical stuff to where you always needed network connectivity. And that was actually a conversation that Kelsey and I had early on when we were exploring some of the connectivity at well sites, especially in rural areas. Would it make sense if the use case for some applications were compelling enough? Would people be willing to put in a network there, right? Would they be willing to lease something like a microwave broadband or, contract out with someone? I know there are lots of providers here that do that. And the answer was maybe, right? If the use case was so compelling, you always want to prevent people that are out there from doing too much on the recreation side. But if the use case and the business value was so high to where a mobile app needed network connectivity, would you consider actually paying for a network to get there as well? And the answer was, yeah, maybe, sometimes.
Well, that's already happening in several areas that we're in, very remote areas, and part of it is a subscription basis, and a company moves in, puts up cell phone towers, et cetera, and it's a local network, and we're already doing that.
Interesting.
One thing that I think we should point out on this slide is, I think with mobile, you have to be very comfortable putting unfinished products in front of people to look at. We've worked on projects that were both, where we went with masterpiece mentality, and it had to be fully baked and working before anyone saw it, and we got to the end of the project just to figure out it was the wrong direction anyway. And then you have cases where, one we're working on with George, we show George stuff every week, even if it's not working fully, right? And the reason we put it in front of him or show it to people is so we can get critical feedback on, those course corrections. I used to, when I first started working in software, one of the things that I learned is you don't want to lean spend a lot of time building a ladder and then lean it against the wrong building, right? And so we want to put it in front of people, even if it's at sketch stage, just to make sure that as we take our next step, we can constantly put software in front of them. And we'd like to say that whenever you see it, it should be releasable, even if it's not finished.
Okay, and that's actually a good tee up to the next section here. The final stage that we're going to talk about during the process is getting that feedback from the field. So let's take this example, for instance. Let's say we built an app that was primarily focused on alerts. Okay, this was one of the suggestions from the audience. And let's say we've got it out in the wild now, and it's missed the mark in some way. And so we've heard this by virtue of kind of grassroots feedback from our users. What do we do with this feedback? How would we incorporate that? How do we act upon what our users are telling us?
I think the alerts one's a good one to talk about. So I think the way I would approach that is I would say it needs to be subdivided into the users, right? So for example, let's for example say you built an app that would buzz in someone's pocket if they were out on the rig. And I can tell you if you're out on the rig, there's a likelihood you won't feel that buzz. That's why they have very loud alerts on the rig. And so part of what I would look at is how do you subdivide those alerts to make sure wherever you are on the rig, you're using the right form factor. And I would argue that there's cases where an alert system just isn't as good as the horn they use out on the rig, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like everyone knows it, and so you have to sort of subdivide those things into those categories.
Yeah, and kind of tying back to the previous slide, there is an expectation with mobile software that when people give you feedback, that's going to get into the next release, and that next release isn't going to be 6 months from now or a year from now, that we can act upon this in a reasonably fast way to make the product better for the users. So whether that is rightly or wrongly informed, that is what the expectation is from your workers, and so you want to try your best to meet that expectation. So I think we're coming up to the final exercise here, Kelsey, talking about finding real needs to fill. It kind of relates to this, I think, but what were you envisioning?
We've kind of been doing it. So I think what I would, it may be more of a discussion than an exercise, but what I would actually encourage you to do that I had to learn how to do is interviewing. Like how do you interview people and really uncover what they're trying to do? Because most of the time, especially in software, people tell you, go build this thing and it should be, I'll give you an example. Go build me a spreadsheet that does this. Well, even if you understand what that spreadsheet's supposed to do, it's always a good practice to sort of figure out what the underlying goal is, because that spreadsheet may not actually be the best solution for it. And so what we do is we spend a lot of time developing questions that help us uncover underlying needs. So that it helps us with that whole usable thing at the front. So if you go back to what we talked at the beginning, usable, useful, and desirable. We always want to make sure those things are optimized, so we spend a lot of time writing questions that really help you guys uncover real needs.
Mm-hmm. So let's open up the floor then in terms of other apps that perhaps you have seen desired in your organization. Maybe there was an actual request for it, or ones that maybe hopefully after today's workshop that you've got an idea for how you would run it through that process. Are there any ideas from the audience? Yes, in the back.
More of a comment. A lot of the challenges that have been expressed in this room, just in my opinion, could be solved by employing some sort of wearable technology to collect the data that they need, and using an app either to interpret that data or to create like an inventory report of that data. Presented, like somebody mentioned employee tracking, and I'm the person with the example with the logging context of my company. And when I first heard about it, and my company was offering like a reward for the top 10 people who took those steps, and I joked with my wife, now HR knows when I'm sitting around doing that. And it was funny, it was just a joke, because, but this band tracks how fast I'm moving at specific times, where what I was doing, how long I was doing it, and it creates a timeline that I have to share. So, my HR department adds up all those steps and then determines who's walking around with us. But I mean, it's got a motion sensor that not only that does that, but also tracks how well I sleep. That that we're not including in the contest, but I feel like that would be a bit weird. But in terms of tracking people's safety, I mean, this thing also has a vibrate function. So if there's like a proximity where I can't be a certain distance from an area, and it can alert me when I'm in danger, that's as simple as this band that vibrates and actually like serves as an alarm. I
I have the sensor that wakes me up at a certain time. And it's like, I'll always feel it because it's right up on my wrist. So I was just wondering, how do you incorporate wearable technology in some of the solutions that you're developing? Do you ever recommend that?
Yeah, I feel like I should give you this $5 bill here as a tee up, as a thank you, because that's actually the last part of our presentation is that power of context, which wearables is definitely a part of that. It's funny, Kelsey and I were presenting at another event over the summer here in Houston, and I was wearing Google Glass. I had only gotten it a few weeks before that, and there was this one lady in the audience when we opened it up for questions who was legitimately freaked out by it. She was concerned that I was videotaping her, even though I wasn't. And one of the previous examples I had given within that presentation was around wearables and being able to potentially gamify or incentivize employees to be healthy because you were tracking their motion and you knew that they were active. And so it had opened up an interesting discussion, like you trade security for convenience or privacy for convenience. It's a push-pull on both of those fronts, and at what point are you comfortable maybe getting a break on your health insurance because they knew that you were active? Right? It's in the same way the wellness programs kind of count towards that. And I don't know if there's a clear answer or not. The same way with Progressive Insurance, they have that little dongle you can put in your OBD or onboard diagnostic, and you're incentivized to not speed. And they have that data on you, and you can't really lie about it because it was tracked and then sent to someplace in the cloud. So I think maybe I'm a bit more open to that than some others, and my wife is definitely on the opposite end of the spectrum than even me. But I don't know, Kelsey, if you have any thoughts on that, the kind of push-pull, and then we can talk about the actual contextual stuff.
I have different answers for consumer versus enterprise. Enterprise is a little bit more control, right?
Sure.
But I always tell people in consumer situations, you've already given up so much more of your privacy than you realize, just from things that, like joining Facebook, you give up a lot of privacy information because they're collecting everything. And so I think it's all about your comfort level. It's kind of like when Apple released Apple Pay, people were kind of freaked out with this whole idea of using their phone to make payments, but nobody's freaked out handing a waiter their credit card to go off into a dark room to charge their credit card. Like, that's actually less secure.
You make it sound so salacious, too.
Right. Yeah. But I think it's going to be relative, right? Like some applications people will be comfortable with, especially if they know the company has sort of got an umbrella of security around it versus it's out in the wild.
Where do you fall on that spectrum, George? I know you're a huge Pinterest guy as well, right? So you've traded that security for convenience?
No.
No? Okay.
I don't want people to know what I'm doing. I'll be the hermit.
Okay. Fair enough.
But I have got a Fitbit.
Oh, well, there you go. Wearable. You're being tracked by the man. We'll get you your tinfoil hat here in a moment.
Yep.
So context. We've talked about this a bit, and if any of you are particularly interested in this, there are a couple of books that I can recommend that really unpackage this on each of the 5 categories that we're going to go through here. So I paid some lip service to it early in the presentation. Contextual technologies. The 5 that we're going to cover here are wearables. We're going to talk about pervasive access to data. We're going to talk about sensor data, collaboration and/or social networking, and finally, the location and environmental awareness. So those kind of evolving fronts are overlapping, and this is making it kind of a really interesting and magical time when it comes to the art of what is possible. And if each of those would have just existed in a silo, it still would have been pretty interesting. But by virtue of them coming to the forefront all at the same time, that's why it's kind of like that hockey stick growth in terms of what's possible, what you're capable of doing. And we fundamentally believe that this truly will change the world. So the first is wearable computing. People may wear activity trackers. I guess at least all 3 of us here are wearing one right now, and the gentleman in the back of the room. The evolution in that space has changed so much just within the past year. I was reading an article this morning about Up, which is a competitor to Fitbit, the fuel band, that they're releasing ones that have insanely advanced sensors to where it can take your temperature, your oxygen rate, and it's collecting it all the time. It's intended to never be taken off, not even in the shower. So it's waterproof up to 10 meters. And the reason why that's interesting in the context of mobile apps is the more data that you're able to gather, even if you're not able to do something with it today, odds are you will be able to pretty soon. People are going to find out new ways to slice and dice that data. And the wearable computing front is still kind of like the tablet front of maybe 5 years ago. No one's really cracked that yet. I'll admit I've stopped wearing my Google Glass very much because it's socially awkward, right? And the social norms haven't evolved to a point. It's much more socially acceptable to have something on your wrist or to have it clipped to your waistband where people don't notice. It's not in their face all the time. So when the social norms catch up with that and you are able to collect a lot more data, that's what's going to enable these kind of next generation applications. Anything you want to add on the wearable front, Kelsey?
I think what's going to sort of be the tipping point here is cost, right? Like I think, especially when you look at Apple getting ready to release a watch. So this band for me only collects heart rate, and I have to have a strap on for it to collect it. But if the Apple Watch can do that for me, it completely invalidates part of the market. Well, like, why would I go buy this? Because it's an extra $250 to have this. So I think what's going to really shake this market out is pricing and how they differentiate between the devices based on what they do and how much they cost.
And that's particularly applicable for business-related applications, right? If you're talking about needing to outfit a team that's going to do a particular type of job, if the price point on a device that the company is going to have to buy is north of $500, it's kind of a non-starter, right? The margins may not exist in that particular job that they're doing to support it, but there will be downward pricing pressure. I think we can all agree on that. And so once it gets to the tipping point, almost impulse buy range, that's when you could see deployments at an enterprise level reach much greater heights. So this diagram at the bottom, it was actually something we were talking about with George yesterday, and it's that mountain of data, right? Data in and of itself is noisy, and you really can't do anything with it. It can be daunting. You don't really know where to start. And so you kind of have to have this funnel type approach to it. You go from a sea of data, and you narrow it down, and then you have information. And information is more actionable than data, but it's still not actionable enough for you to feel kind of empowered by it. But once you get down to knowledge, once you've siphoned it down to really extract the critical points, that's when you've made the data interesting. That's when you've whittled it down. George, anything you want to add to that? Because I know this is something you teach upon.
Yeah, we have mountains of data coming into us, but you've got to condense the data to usable information, but there's still too much. And then you've got to develop it into knowledge on a decision point of where do I use this? But the loop that I'm always talking about is that learning loop that comes back in. You can take it one step further and take it down to wisdom. You can actually teach that person from the data that they are gathering and the tasks that they are doing. You can teach them how to do it better. And I think you might even be able to make a jump into innovation here of giving them an option of, okay, this is the problem. You would solve it this way. Reverse it, invert it, look at it a different way. Is there another way to do this? And so I think you could take it 2 more steps anyway.
And Kelsey, I know you have the personas here at the top. This comes from some of the human factors stuff.
So,
do you want to describe these?
You know, it's funny because when we first started looking at this, the whole data, information, knowledge thing, it makes perfect sense, right? Like you take large amounts of stuff and you boil it down to the point where people can use it. The missing layer on there that a lot of people miss is actually something you learn when you're a manager anyways. Just like you can't manage everyone the same, not all mobile users are the same. And so what we found is these different personas, we call these sort of the core 4 mobile personas, they look at knowledge differently. And even at this table, I could tell you, we probably, like Juston is definitely a technology devotee, and I'm a mobile lifestyle person. Like I really only pull out my phone when I'm on the go. Juston is who I go to find out everything I need to know about the latest technology because I already know he's my source. And so if you kind of look at how this works, is you've got this flow from data to knowledge. The next thing you need to understand is how your particular users fall into these buckets because it's going to determine how you build your software. If you know that you're going to have a user base that is anywhere from the age of 18 to about 27, there's a high likelihood that they're in that mobile first category. And if they use their phone for everything, I know my brother-in-law is this way. His phone is his computer. It's his primary go-to device, even though he has a laptop. And so when you understand that, it sort of helps you tailor this flow to more adequately meet the needs of that user base, especially since we know that's what we're going to be using to control a lot of the contextual functionality.
Mm-hmm. So the next contextual lever, we spent a little time talking about this already, are the sensors, and the way in which more sensors are being packed into mobile devices, to some degree wearables like is pictured here, but the mobile devices, and those open up new opportunities for app ideas, because previously you would have to manually enter perhaps the temperature that you were currently experiencing when you're in an environment. But now there's a temperature gauge within the latest mobile devices, and that can be passively gathered. And so the easier it is to streamline that data acquisition process, piggybacking on these sensors, that's what makes the user experience really become that delightful thing that we're shooting for. Nobody likes manually entering data. Nobody likes even validating the data when they're in context. But if you can harvest that data passively and then get them to validate it at some later time, that's when people really enjoy that mobile experience.
You know, this is sort of a side note that we realize in user experiences, we all know people are completely irrational. Like, they will justify one thing over another. And whenever I see these Apple Watches, I always give people the examples. If I asked 10 of my friends today to go out and spend $900 on a Rolex, they'd all look at me like I was crazy. But in January, they're going to spend $900 on an Apple Watch, and it's completely the
irrational.
Same. It's irrational, but we already know that people do this, right? And so part of what we're doing when designing this is playing off of that. We know they're going to make some decisions that don't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So social networking is kind of a polarizing term in the same way that big data is. And we've talked a lot about this. In fact, when we were talking to George yesterday and we had this social networking slide, he kind of buckled back in his chair and said, I don't know if we need to talk about that. But social networking at its essence is just about connecting people and kind of removing the friction for them to communicate and collaborate. And so what's interesting with mobile devices, it's kind of like back in the late 90s, remember if you had a desktop computer and you had AOL Instant Messenger on it, it was kind of neat that you could just point to point have a conversation without having to pick up a phone. It was a very frictionless way of doing it, and now we take it for granted. People do that with text messaging all the time, or they do it with Snapchat or some other pictorial form of messaging. But in business, collaboration is key, right? Being able to communicate in a way that isn't bureaucratic and without a lot of red tape, that's how business gets done. And so if mobile accelerates that, that's really what we want to capitalize on. Any thoughts, gentlemen, on that? Just kind of what you see?
You know, I think we've kind of seen it over the last decade as companies are figuring out how to embrace social, especially because a lot of the younger workers that are coming in, they're familiar with that paradigm. It's just how do you use it effectively in a business environment. But the whole idea of being able to collaborate real time is something that I think you have to really think through.
Okay, and I'm going to skip ahead one slide here because we've already kind of talked about this and talk finally about the levers before we open up the floor. So, Kelsey, this is your concept. Let's. What do these mean, the levers?
So, really, this kind of boils back down to what I was telling you guys about understanding what people are trying to accomplish. And a lot of times, what we'll do as a team is we'll figure out where the balance is between these endpoints. So, if you have something that needs to be used infrequently versus repetitively, the way we approach that device and that software would be a little bit different. Whether it's used for reference or data capture is another checkpoint. And then how important is task completion? So you'll notice that the things over here, and actually we should have reversed urgent task and not critical, but the things that typically would fall on this side, we're going to try to automate them as much as possible, and we're going to try to figure out where we can help the users versus the other side are things that are less time sensitive or less critical, so we want to see how do we make them more engaging. And so that's typically the model that we're using when we look at that. And you really kind of figure out where your software fits on all three of those continuums.
All right, folks, that's essentially it. We'll open up the floor, or if folks want to come up to the front and ask questions, we're happy to field those for a while as well. Any for the broader audience, though, that you would like to open up the discussion on?
I like to ask a question of the last that you just showed.
Sure.
Given that nothing is static, how do you ensure that as the things change, that no matter who in the real world, the application is able to adapt?
So what I would tell you is that it's not just, he says, everything's not static. So as the environment and things change, how do you make sure the application adapts to those changes? I think part of that comes from your process, right? So if your process is built around, and I hate using waterfall as if it's the wrong way to do it, because it's not necessarily the wrong way to do it. What I would tell you is if your process is one where it's hard to get the feedback back into the software loop, that's where you need to look at this and figure out if it's really going to fit into your model. But for us, these things are generic enough where if we can go back and we say, well, they're using this thing more than we thought they would use it. We need to go back and understand why they're using it more than we thought and work that back into what we call a user story. And that becomes a requirement for upgrades to the software.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, we definitely favor simplicity over complexity. And if that means that you have a fit-for-purpose app that has a single use case, and then you have a second app that's going to address that more dynamic or complex scenario, that would be preferable as opposed to bundling all those things into one app that could adjust in real time. We're seeing this trend definitely in the consumer space right now to where you debundle the feature of Facebook's a good example. Right now they have Messenger as a separate app. And so because you want to chat with people, you don't want to navigate through a lot of other options that could have been available to you within a single or uni-purpose app. But getting the user to the activity that they're most likely to encounter or that they're most likely to need to use within a mobile app, that should be the driving factor.
Just a couple other things that strike me, and it has to do with app acceptance in both cases. One is differentiating between the sophisticated user and the new user and making it work for both. The Windows ribbon bar comes to mind. Massive failure there. And so that's one. And then the other one is how do you deal with, it's always that thing in an organization where you're imposing something new. And if you can get the potential users to embrace that concept ahead of time, then your success rate goes way up. But as soon as it comes down from on top, boom, you can start doing this, your chance of failure go way up.
Yeah.
And part of that involving the people who are going to have to be using it in the design, making them part of it, including beta testing and all of these things that's going to have to be done, where when they get out, you've not only got a core of users, but you've got a core of users that can teach other people about how useful it is. This is what we use for other forms of technology out in the field.
In some organizations, that second question you ask could be a big, hairy political problem, right?
Right.
I did a timesheet system for one company, and the CIO was telling me how the timesheet system should work. And so I listened to him for about 30 minutes, and then the only question I asked him was, when was the last time you entered a timesheet? And once he understood that, he got it. So in that case, it was easy, right? You asked the right question, not you don't know how to enter a timesheet. I just asked him, when was the last time you entered a timesheet? And he understood that he was the wrong person to be giving me the requirement. Your first question about advanced users versus new users, we have this concept, what we call progressive disclosure. So where you build the application to sort of understand where the user is in their learning process. So you expose more functionality over time, whereas the ribbon just kind of throws everything out there.
Right.
To this day, I still can't find stuff in the ribbon when I need to find it. But I think what you do is you only show functionality when people actually need it. But you put it in there contextually so it's easy for them to find and they don't have to dig around. I think one of the key functions that people don't make use of enough is search, right? Like I think if you have more stuff of well-designed search is really the best answer to a lot of those things where you've got a lot of functionality and not a lot of space.
Yeah, just one final comment, and kind of going back to what George said, if you involve the actual end users early, and this is to address your second question, and they get excited about it, having some vocal evangelists there that can kind of maybe get some mind share going early on tends to help with adoption. And so that doesn't happen if you're just kind of doing the big reveal and they had no say in the process. And if it doesn't actually address their need, then of course it's going to fall flat on its face. But never underestimate the power of those users at that level kind of being the flag bearers for the new software.
We build what we must, and we buy what we can. I'm wondering whether you are able to share with us what you believe is really shipping out there, is whatever can be useful in the work that we do in the field.
Well, I would say that's a common refrain we hear, right? Like that's when I was in a previous life doing custom software development, the first question most customers or prospects led with is, does this exist off the shelf? Because I would love to not have to pay $500,000 to build it for me myself. So we definitely think, and I think that's very common in the oil and gas industry. They prefer to buy over build, whether it's any of the major operators. That's always the philosophy. You know, my view is that if it gets you kind of 80% of the way there, and then you're able to tweak a product, right, to get you into your business workflow, that's optimal. Because there are a variety of downsides of having to, if you must build it, you build it, the maintenance associated with that. I mean, just keeping up with the evolution of technology, which, as I hope we've illustrated today, is accelerating. That's the less preferable option, and the ones that we would advise people to stay away from, if possible.
Are there any examples of shipping products you would mention, not necessarily recommend?
I don't know if you guys, I mean, obviously we are building products with Nomadic. I don't want this to be a sales pitch by any means, but it's targeted at the oil field. There are some other players out there. It depends on the use case. I mean, and it depends on how sophisticated, whether it's more focused on the engineering side or it's more focused on general productivity, kind of like we were discussing earlier. So I know you spent some time in Halliburton, if there were different service provider recommended ones, but
I don't know if Halliburton's the best example. I mean, Halliburton made the early decision to build a team internally.
Sure.
I think what I would say is you have to look at the thing you're building and understand the cost of what it might take to build that internally versus buy it off the shelf. What we saw was a variety of things. Like they would buy platforms, but maybe not completed software. So the platform provided a lot of functionality. And I think depending on what drives your organization, so if you're in an IT-driven organization, there's at least a 50-50 chance it's going to be built versus bought. It just really depends on the functionality that they want to get out of it.
Sure.
Awesome. That's root.
Well, if there's nothing else, we appreciate your time. We'll be up here for a few minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of the event.